Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
So welcome and thank you so much for giving us your Thursday evening. We really appreciate it. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Adesara, who's going to give you an introduction.
Thanks, Becca. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, brilliant. So hi everyone, my name's Adesara, and as Becca said, I organise with Abolitionist Futures, which is a collective working together to build a future without prisons, police and punishment. Today I'll give an overview of the question of policing and abolition, whilst my fellow panellists will give a more in-depth take on the following issues: street policing and justice for police violence, policing, work and survival, UK policing in the world, policing health and essential services. So much of the analysis and news coverage on abolition these days is focused on the US context, its history, its present and visions being formulated for a possible future. And this to an extent is understandable given the amount and the long violent history of the US and its policing apparatus. But when we talk about policing in the context of the UK, it's important to talk about it in its own terms and its own history. So thinking about the UK policing in its own terms, rather than just transposing what is happening in America and taking it as an example. So in addition to the inspiring mobilisation we saw this summer under the Black Lives Matter banner, we of course have our own traditions of resistance against policing here in Britain. 2020 marks 50 years since the arrest of the Mangrove 9. These are 9 Black activists harassed by the police as part of the escalating war against Britain's then power Black movement. It was the conclusion of their trial which saw the very first acknowledgement of racial hatred within the Metropolitan Police, nearly 3 decades before the Lawrence Inquiry's seminal verdict of institutional racism. Then there was our very own uprising sparked by police violence, including the historic flashpoints of 1981, 1985 and 2011 as well. And that's without mentioning the long history of defence and justice campaigns against the police brutality and negligence, from the Hillsborough Justice campaigns to the United Families and Friends campaign. So in talking about Britain's history with the police and also its importance, it's also important to reframe how we understand policing and the police itself. As we will cover in more detail later on the panel, Britain's policing has historically been exported elsewhere. So British policing meant policing the empire through social control of the colonies and practicing things before importing them right back here on the British working class. This boomerang continued even after the British Empire was broken up, and it appears to be Britain's gift to much of the world. Equally, when talking about abolition and defunding in Britain, we also need to broaden our lens. Any conversation on policing and abolition in Britain is incomplete without factoring in the 3 pillars of policing today. First being ordinary policing, as many of us think about it. The second being immigration and control, and the third being counter-terrorism policing. And the many forms that all 3 of these pillars take, and some of our panelists today will delve deeper into some of these things. For this reason, campaigning for a world without police cannot merely be on the form of policing, that is to say, just focusing on the figures of the police officer or the force on the ground. It must also focus on policing as a set of relations that are designed to uphold capitalist notions of law and order, to defend private property and to subordinate the exploited masses of people. It is vital that the British left engage with and embrace campaigns towards abolition and defunding the police, which are, in the first instance, the very grave diggers of any left project. But even outside of theory, the issue of policing is a very visceral reality for many people in Britain, especially young Black, brown, and the working class community. For many young people here, their first encounter with the police is being intimidated by them during stop and search. In my case, it was witnessing this and feeling a deep sense of hopelessness and anger that accompanied it that made me initially start to distrust the police. My estate in East London has a long history of the police not turning up when you need them and then turning up in massive numbers when you don't. So it's in these seeds of discontent and distrust of authority that the British left must nurture into a structural analysis of power and develop into campaigns for broad social change. And finally, on the topic of abolition, crime is often seen as fundamentally caused by bad people, rather than thinking about it being understood as being a product of broken society. So policing and punishment takes place of meaningful attempts to rebuild society, maintaining the system of inequality and creating a vicious cycle of dependency on police to solve our issues, rather than allowing us to formulate wide-ranging solutions to our society problems. Because of this, the government spent almost the same amount on policing, prisons and courts last year as it did on public health and social housing and social care, despite these leading towards very different and many conflicting outcomes. And the fact does remain that the policing don't fight crime as we know it. 92% of all cases end with no charge or prosecution, and this jumps to 98% for crimes related to sexual violence. At the end of the day, the police will never break down patriarchy. They are sexist themselves and they are racist. They uphold systems that enable and reproduce sexism and racism every day. And fundamentally, they were not built to work for ordinary people, and so they cannot work for ordinary people. So if we just stop there, so we can't ultimately just argue about the efficiency of the police and what they claim to do. Because if we just stop there, we're already conceding that the police are justified in existence, and we're already conceding to the category of crime that they use as being valid, logical, and objective. And it's for this reason that abolitionists often articulate issues in terms of harm rather than the legal category of crime. As part of our argument, we have to talk about the criminalisation of activities and how much of a political process that is, and how it is shaped around the defence of wealth and private interests, thereby sustaining and deepening the disposition from which harm and social violence emerges. Defunding the police, as I'm sure you're all aware, is about reducing the scope of the police. Abolition aims to work towards a society that does not need the police or prisons. To put it simply, defund is a tactic and abolition is the horizon. So it's important that we articulate a very social and political vision for the type of society that we want through abolition, rather than just operating on a budgetary logic. If we only focus on funding, then the risk is that we end up with merely changing the shape of policing, perhaps seeing it outsourced to private companies or shifted onto communities through social surveillance, and we've seen that through Prevent. We have to be wary about defunding the police, we have to be very wary about defunding the police, looking like the spread of the arms of the police onto other services. For that reason, abolitionist organising has to go beyond a simplistic understanding of the police and also tackle the very logistical, the very logic of punishment and policing that underpins it, rather than just shifting it around. So with that, I look forward to hearing from other speakers and about how we can build effective campaigns and what that might look like on the ground. But I also wanted to shout out abolitionist futures. So alongside Reading Lists and support for setting up Reading Lists, activists have very recently worked on some resources to help us understand what reforms might look like compared to abolitionist steps. And I encourage you all to have a look. So thanks for listening, and I pass on to Adam, who'll be giving a bit more detail next.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay and all that. So I work for an organisation called the Monitoring Group, and they're an organisation that was started in the 1970s in a part of West London called Southall. And they were founded following the racist murder of a young man called Gurdeep Singh Chaggar, who was killed by fascists in Southall in the 1970s. And one of the reasons that the kind of precursor to the Monitoring Group at the time, it was called the Southall Youth Movement, but that was in the 1970s, and the founders aren't so young anymore, first started their organisation was because primarily the police were not in any way effective in tackling the kinds of racial violence that was being experienced by young black and brown many black and brown communities across Southall and indeed many parts of the United Kingdom in the 1970s. And so what they therefore decided to do was to organise among themselves. They decided they had to defend themselves. They organised large protests when the National Front bands supporting and other kind of organisations supporting the National Front tried to hold meetings in their local town hall, or have racist bands and musicians performing in their local pubs. They would march and protest and confront those kinds of fascist organisations. But of course, what they also found, not only were the police totally ineffective in defending them from racial violence, but as has already been mentioned, the police were also fundamental in criminalising those black and brown communities living in Southall during this time. And so there were two reasons here why defunding or abolishing the police was a fundamental concern of people within what became the monitoring project. First, as I mentioned, was the fact that the police weren't effective at all in defending black and brown communities from fascist violence. But on the other hand, as well, they actually added to that violence. They brought more racist violence to their communities rather than less. So defunding the police is a fundamentally important part of the work that the monitoring group does. So today we continue to provide advocacy, support, guidance, campaigns for people who have been survivors of racial violence, or whose families have been killed through racial violence. This is primarily because, of course, the police are totally ineffective in providing the kind of support that people need. So rather than them getting the kind of emotional support that they need, the kind of support in terms of housing or running a campaign, all of those types of things, it's communities, it's our organisations that need to do that kind of work. And so working or outside of the kind of state mechanisms or state organisations such as the police, in order to challenge this kind of racist violence, is a fundamentally important part of the kind of work that the monitoring group does. But there's another aspect to this as well, which I think is really important, and that's the fact that far too often the police not only are ineffective in addressing these forms of different forms of racial violence, but they actually bring more violence to the situation. I mean, the most obvious and probably most well-known case study of this is the case of Stephen Lawrence, for which the monitoring group were part of the Stephen Lawrence family campaign back in the 1990s, and helped to bring about the McPherson inquiry that eventually found the police to be institutionally racist. And of course, within that situation, when Stephen Lawrence was killed and Dwayne Brooks, his friend, had witnessed that particular murder, not only did the police totally ineffective in supporting Dwayne Brooks or investigating that particular murder, but they criminalised Stephen and Dwayne. They asked them questions around whether it was gang violence, whether they had been harassing young women at a local McDonald's earlier that evening. They asked them. They tried to find out different things about them to see if they had been involved in violence or criminality themselves. And this is one, I think, small case study of a wider problem where policing brings more violence to communities that are already experiencing racial harassment and violence. And so, as I mentioned, one of the ways in which I guess we can do kind of a defunding the police kind of campaign, so in other words, take power and resources away from the police and put them into community campaigns where we can have community-led resistance to fascist and racist violence. And that being one really important aspect of the ways in which we move towards abolishing the police, and that being a really important campaign goal. But other ways in which we think about it also are ways in which we can erode the ability of the police to enact racial violence themselves. So a lot of the people that we work with that provide advocacy and support for and those types of things are people who have experienced racial violence at the hands of the police themselves. So people who have been badly beaten up or wrongfully arrested and stitched up by the police, or even killed by the police. And so by campaigning through ways that erode the power and resources of the police, whether that be campaigning to reduce or eradicate the police who are able to be armed with firearms or armed with tasers, or have the ability to use different types of force and different types of techniques of power and control, by eroding their ability to use surveillance and different kinds of technologies to spy or surveil communities and different kinds of organisation. All of these kinds of aspects of the kind of campaign work that the monitoring group does feeds into a wider campaign to defund the police, right? Because I think rather than in the United States, where you have very kind of clear budgets and within different jurisdictions, in which you can take in a very mathematical way take certain parts of a budget away from policing criminal justice and move it to housing, or move it to healthcare, or move it to another part of social policy. Things work quite differently here in the United Kingdom. I think it's important for us to still think about the idea of defunding the police in a more general sense, and that general sense is eroding the power and resources of the police and reinvesting that power and resource into our community organisations, into our grassroots political organisations as well. And I think it's through that kind of thinking that we can take things like resistance to racial violence and understand that the kind of racial violence that we see from fascists on the streets is very much connected to the state violence that we see from institutions like the police and immigration authorities. And I think the last thing I think that's really important about the work that the monitoring group does is it works against the kind of language of hate crime. Hate crime is something that we see being used a great deal, particularly by the NGO sector. And the problem that we have with hate crime, the language of hate crime, is that it depoliticizes racial violence. It creates the impression that people beat up black people, or Muslim people, or Asian people, or other racialized minorities because they hate them. And they don't do it because they hate them. They do it because racism is a system of control, and it's part of a wider system of control that is linked to the power of the state, of the police, of the prison system, of our border system, right? These things are very much linked. And by creating the idea that there's hate crime over here where some people just hate, and then there's other types of institutional racism, which is more political, I think creates the impression that these types of racisms are not intimately linked. And by fighting fascist and racist violence on the streets and fighting the institutional violence of our police, prisons, and border regimes, I think we can have a far more effective anti-racist movement against all forms of racial violence that understand all of these as a movement to defund and eventually abolish the police. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was fantastic. A lot to think about there. We're now going to hear from Connor Woodman, who will talk a bit more about UK policing and its role in the world more widely.
Hi, thanks, Adam and Hajira. That was really great. Yeah, I was asked to talk a little bit about, I think in this first round of the panel, talk about the work that we're involved in, and I thought that gave me an opportunity to sort of connect the micro and the macro level, because two things I'm involved in at the moment quite a lot is the West Papuan Liberation Movement and ACORN, the Community and Tenants Union. And the work of those might seem disconnected, but I guess I hope to sort of show some ways that an abolitionist perspective can bring some of those sort of micro and macro political activities together. Just to do a very whistle-stop history of West Papua, for those of you who don't know, it's a territory that is occupied by the Indonesian state, has been since 1962. West Papua is the western half of the island of New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is on the eastern half as an independent state. And the occupation is, as you'd imagine, as military colonial occupations are, incredibly brutal. And there's a large-scale indigenous self-determination movement for West Papuan independence to form their own independent state. So to talk a little bit about that and about how abolitionism has some role to play in that, well, on the ground in West Papua, the movement is seeking to abolish the existence of Indonesian military and police entirely from the country. But in terms of an international solidarity perspective from the UK, there are all kinds of ways in which Western governments, Western states support the Indonesian occupation in West Papua, and particularly through police links and training. And it kind of shows us how what happens in the UK in policing terms gets disseminated out and used for repressive purposes. And then, as Sajira said in her introduction, sometimes comes back to the UK in a kind of what sometimes gets called Imperial Boomerang effect. So to give you a specific example, there's an Indonesian police unit called Detachment 88 or Densus 88, which was set up after the Bali bombings in 2002. This unit is a so-called counter-terrorism unit. It's deployed in West Papua. It's implicated in beatings, torture, the arrest of civil society organizers, etc. And this unit is entirely a Western creation. It's funded primarily by the Australian Federal Police, but the number 2 trainer and funder of this unit at a place called the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation in Indonesia's capital is the Metropolitan Police. Now, if you look at the UK Metropolitan Police, London Metropolitan Police, now if you look at the details of the relationship there, this Indonesian special forces police unit is trained by the Metropolitan Police in informant handling, in interrogation, in surveillance, and you can track the history of some of the Met police officers who are deployed there to train this Indonesian unit, and some of them have a illustrious history in what's called domestic extremism policing here in the UK. Domestic extremism policing is what used to be called counter-subversion. It's kind of capital P political policing of those organisations that are explicitly have political aims. And our listeners might be familiar with the undercover policing, the spy cop scandal here. There's a long history in the UK of branches of the police infiltrating, surveilling, monitoring, undermining political organisations of all kinds, but overwhelmingly on the left, on the progressive variety. So some of those officers have then gone into training overseas police units, for example, in Indonesia, that are then used to crush indigenous mass self-determination movements. So there's a real role for Western solidarity activists, particularly those who are in countries that support the Indonesian state, to basically run campaigns and to put pressure on the British government to cut that link. And that's what happened in East Timor quite successfully in the 90s. A lot of training and military support to Indonesia was cut off, and that was part of many things, but that was part of what led to the process of East Timor becoming independent from the Indonesian occupation. So I would point people towards something called Make West Papua Safe. That's a campaign to halt all kinds of international police and military links between Indonesia and mainly Western countries. So that's, let me just see how long I've got. So that's on West Papua, and then only 2 minutes. So to link it very quickly to ACORN on the local level, a lot of the time what we do in ACORN is we go into local communities. I'm here in Oxford, and we talk to people on the door, and we ask them what their problems are and how we can work together collectively to overcome them. And they'll often say things about drugs or antisocial behavior, or they don't feel safe in the local community. And sometimes that can lead to a knee-jerk reaction that they want more police and they want more security, they want more CCTV cameras. But actually through the process of doing the community organising and talking to people and building up those relationships over time, people quite quickly move to the conclusion that there are better and other ways of dealing with this. So one woman I was talking to on Sunday in Rosehill Estate in Oxford was talking about the fact that there are always a lot of youngsters hanging around drinking, and it makes her feel unsafe. And I just kind of asked the question, well, why do you think they're doing that? And she very quickly drew the conclusion, well, there's no services here in Rosehill for them. There's nothing for young people to be doing. Rosehill was left and abandoned. When people think of Oxford, they think of the Dream Inspires, think of the university, they don't think of Rosehill. And these people, you know, in our area around here, we're just kind of left with very little services, very little for people to do. So it should be up to the council and up to communities to come together and invest in alternatives rather than relying on the police. So a lot of what we do in ACORN is basically trying to build that sort of local power that would take you know, communities away from looking towards institutions like the police that won't fix any of those problems, as we know, and sort of looking at how can we address the root causes of these social issues and actually build a sort of community unity and a spirit and a power that allows people to come together and defend their interests and build a more fulfilling life and community. Now, in the second part, I will make some more comments about how those two things might be related, sort of the international solidarity stuff and the local community organising. But for there, I think I'm out of time, so I'll move on. I can't remember who was next. Becker, if you could.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Connor. Okay, so next we're going to hear from Sonia Adesara, who is an NHS doctor and campaigner from Docs Not Cops, a group fighting xenophobia and racism for bringing borders to the NHS and restricting access to healthcare.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. So I think first I would just state the obvious. There is an inherent harm to health to those at the harsh end of policing and state violence. So the mortality rate for people who are serving custodial sentences is 50% higher than the general population, higher rates of mental illness. They are 20 times more likely to suffer from psychosis. The biology of the body of someone that's been in prison is over a decade older than someone that hasn't been in prison. And of course, there have been many deaths of people in state custody. And we see similar statistics for people who are in immigration detention. So, inadequate healthcare, high rates of mental illness and self-harm, and high rates of preventable deaths. But today I'm going to be focusing on immigration enforcement and the processes of bordering, how they make people more vulnerable to ill health, more vulnerable to premature death, and how the state has operated through healthcare to target migrants and racialized minorities. But I think hopefully it become clear, and what the other speakers touched on is that whether we're talking about immigration enforcement or counter-terrorism surveillance or police violence, the ideology underlying these and the processes and the methods used are not dissimilar. So when we are thinking about countering these, we have to have a shared and collective understanding to effectively counter this. So Docs Not Cops campaigns, specifically against the hostile environment in the NHS. So the hostile environment, I'm sure most of you know, but just to recap for those who don't know, there are a set of policies brought in 2014 and 2016 under Theresa May. But I think, we just have to be clear that there's been a hostile environment in this country for many, many years towards immigrants, and that's been sustained by policies and the rhetoric by political parties of both sides. But the hostile environment that came in under Theresa May effectively outsourced immigration control to every aspect of public life. So it turned, health workers, people working in schools, landlords, bankers into border guards. So whether you're trying to access healthcare, trying to send your kid to school, trying to rent a house, trying to open a bank account, you've been met with immigration enforcement. And how this works in the NHS, essentially, if you are suspected as foreign, if you're a person of colour, if you've got a strange surname like mine, then you'll be faced with ID checks and trying to access care. And if you're not able to prove that you are entitled to free care, then you'll be charged for healthcare. So you'll be charged 150% of the cost of care. And you can be refused care up front if you can't pay those charges up front. So, I can give you, there's so many examples, but there was a case that got a bit of attention. So some of you may have heard of Alfreda Spencer. She was a woman in her 70s that came here from Jamaica. She came here to see her daughter. Whilst here, she got diagnosed with cancer. Her family couldn't afford the £30,000 required upfront to pay for her palliative chemotherapy. So palliative care is what we give to people to stop them suffering in the end stages of their life. So this woman, her daughter said that her mother died in agony. She died without any care. And her daughter said that her mother was stripped of any dignity in the end stages of her life. So I think that's just, I guess the iceberg of the inhumanity of these policies. But there are many, many people like this who have suffered, and actually many more that we won't know about due to the nature of these policies. And then the second, I think, really pernicious part of this policy is a connection and the data sharing that happens between public services and the Home Office. Now I'll talk about this more in the second part of the talk, and after a breakout session. But the sharing happens both ways between the NHS and the Home Office. And just to give you an example of how this works in practice, so there's a woman a couple of years ago who was assaulted. She went to a sexual assault referral centre, who then went on to contact the Home Office, and then she was put into a detention centre. So I think that's just how gross this policy is when it's enacted out. And then still today, this data sharing is happening. So despite the fact that we're in a deadly pandemic, there are people right now on our streets who are unwell, but they can't go and see the doctor because they're too scared of being put into detention. And of course, you know, COVID has shown us that being healthy, you know, not dying prematurely is not just about access to healthcare, but these policies also, you know, act in every aspect of your life. So these policies deny your right to work legally. So, you know, I guess inevitably forcing people to work into exploitative working conditions, because employers know that you have no choice and that you have no rights. And we saw that recently with Leicester. So there was a breakout in Leicester, and it was found that the breakout happened in garment factories, and there were many women there who were migrant women. They were getting paid below minimum wage, they were working in really unsafe conditions. These women were being told to come in even when they had COVID. And of course, you know, they've just got no other option. The other thing about, we have things called no recourse to public funds. That means you don't have any access to welfare support. Again, something that we've seen in COVID, which is life-saving for many people. You know, another thing we've seen under COVID, domestic violence rates increasing. So under no recourse to public funds, you don't have access to refuges. So if you are a woman who is suffering abuse or violence, essentially these policies are telling you you either have to stay with your abusive or violent partner, or your other options are destitution or detention and deportation. So this is what the choices that these policies are leading people with. So I think, you know, hopefully it's clear that these policies are inhumane. I think there's no other way to describe it. And these policies are inherently racist, and I will talk about that more, but there's a clear racist history underlying these policies, and of course how they're carried out, you know, involves racial profiling on a daily basis as well. So immigration enforcement, these processes of bordering, you know, systematically strip people of their rights, of their dignity, and they target and deliberately marginalizing and oppressing people who are already the most, you know, dispossessed in our society. So I think, you know, I guess, you know, there's always a debate of reform versus abolition. To be honest, I think we can't be tinkering around the edges of a system like this. It's an inherently racist and knowingly oppressive and violent system. So immigration enforcement, this, you know, dismantling this system, dismantling bordering processes must be core part of the abolition conversation. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Okay, now we're going to hear from our last speaker, who is V. V is a board member of SWARM, the Sex Worker Advocacy and Resistance Movement, and also a PhD student researching sex workers' experiences of domestic violence. V will be our last speaker before we go into breakout groups, so please take it away.
Cool, and just let me know if I'm sort of coming up to the end of my time. So I'm from SWARM, and I'm just going to be reading off my notes, sorry for my eyes are going everywhere. We were founded by, and we continue to be led by, sex workers, and we campaign for the rights and safety of everyone who sells sexual services. A police abolitionist or a police defunding position is sort of folded into the core values of SWARM. Firstly, because we take an explicit anti-carceral, anti-police stance in our opposition to the Nordic model legislation around sex work. And for those who don't know, SWARM are part of the global movement which advocate for the full decriminalisation of sex work. Countries such as Sweden, Norway, Israel, Iceland, Canada have all adopted the Nordic model. The Nordic model varies from country to country, but the emphasis is on greater police powers to criminalise the buyers of sex whilst ostensibly decriminalising the sale of sex. So the idea is that women, because it is usually women, but people who sell sex won't feel sort of the heel of the law, but the buyers will. But evidence from Amnesty International, from the World Health Organization, from Doctors of the World has shown how greater police powers mean that sex workers are living with and dealing with more violence whilst being more afraid of the police, because their bodies are essentially crime scenes and their access to an income is criminalized. Secondly, although Swarm don't have specific defund the police campaigns, our framework and our core values are very much community driven. And sex workers, like many other marginalised communities, are relentlessly targeted by the police. And sex workers are often dismissed, disregarded, or disbelieved when we seek safety or protection from the police. Swarm have worked with sex workers who have been told after being assaulted that as sex workers it's not possible to withdraw consent, so the complaint is going to be no further actioned. We've also worked with sex workers who have had their premises raided and closed down when they've been victims of assault and robbery by clients. So community support, which is sort of peer support and peer-led, is and effectively being each other's backbone, a key to sex worker survival, not a reliance on carceral justice. Although I won't say that Swarm will work with or work adjacent with like violence against women and girls kind of organisations, because we absolutely don't. Certain interests are crossed over, especially around, I guess, being victim of sexual violence or being victim of domestic violence. And many of these pushes for stronger incarceration tactics as a method of keeping women safe are sort of part of this feminist, kind of carceral feminist campaign. During COVID and during the rise of the domestic violence that was happening under lockdown, there was a lot of social media push around calling the police if you suspect domestic abuse. But this belies the fact that the police often escalate the situation. The police arrest the wrong victim. Often mandatory arrests means that even when the victim withdraws their complaints, an arrest is still made. And when the victim withdraws their complaint, the police often say it's because, you know, they were making it up, when actually it's because they want to stay in the relationship but just have the violence dealt with and have the violence worked with, not their partner locked up. Throwing the perpetrator in prison and giving them a criminal record actually increases these triggers of violence. It doesn't help anybody. Swarm's clear stance against carceral feminism, along with the full decriminalisation of sex work, are really amongst Swarm's main goals. And this calls for fundamentally an end to the policing of sex work. The partial criminalisation of sex work in this country results in police who feel emboldened and who feel vindicated to harass sex workers who are more often than not homeless, street-based, migrant, sex workers of colour, working class and queer. And so by decriminalising sex work, we remove this particular tactic of targeted violence and harassment against these marginalised communities, but we also limit funding that can be directed towards these policing systems of surveillance and raids. By the way, it also goes to say that these raids on brothels result in police officers taking money and passports and keeping them as evidence. I worked with a brothel in the area where I live, where 30 women were working. There was a police raid. The police took all of their earnings for the night, their passports, their bad clients list, and all their CCTV cameras, and they kicked down the doors to gain entry. And after the police, the sex workers actually reported that they felt less safe than before. None of the sex workers got any of their money back, and this is the middle of December, and none of them got their passports back either, so none of them could go home for Christmas. There was no internal investigation done, even though no victims of trafficking were found and no arrests were made. I think that the sex industry itself is an example of how, thank you, Becca, is an example of how the police, as well as state intervention, fail to prevent violence or protect the most vulnerable, and rather create new forms of violences as well. Often it's argued that police say that prostitution must remain illegal so cops can rescue people from sex trafficking, which involves forcing or coercing someone into sex work, which is already illegal. And often sex work and sexual trafficking is conflated, and the rhetoric around sex trafficking, as Sonia was saying, it fuels this vigilantism and extra surveillance because of the hostile environment. And the rhetoric fuels funding for various forms of surveillance and emboldens and encourages reporting of suspected trafficked victims, when actually they just get channeled into the national referral mechanism rather than any support actually within the community. And I guess I'll just save the rest for the second bit, but I hope that was clear enough. So thank you.
Thank you so much to V. Okay, so the next part of this Zoom, we're going to send all of you guys, you participants, into breakout groups. And in your breakout group, you'll have some other participants with you. You'll have one of our amazing speakers there, and you'll also have one of our fantastic volunteer facilitators. And really, this is just kind of 20 minutes, 25 minutes to talk with other people. You'll be able to ask the speaker any questions and also to talk amongst yourselves with help from the facilitator about kind of what comes up, what has come up in the talks that you've heard. We do have a few questions which I'll just say which might help generate a bit of discussion. Thinking about how the speakers' discussions of policing in their work and their communities relate to your own understanding or experience of police and policing. Whether the kind of campaign goals and organising that they've talked about would make an impact in your community or in any campaigns that you're involved in. And if so, what sort of impact might that be? How you could perhaps involve some of this community or organising work into what you do in your kind of daily activities. Does it relate? Does it make sense? Does it feel like it gels? And anything that you think might be more useful to learn. So Hope, who's very helpfully helping us with tech on this call, will send everyone into the breakout groups, have those discussions, and when we come back, we'll hear a kind of wrapping up from speakers, and every participant will also be given the opportunity to vote on kind of what resources might help them to think further about this stuff. So we look forward to that. I just wanted to say, I will just drop in the chat now a link for our second event, which is on the 24th of September, so in 2 weeks, and that's a real kind of practical deep dive for people who want to incorporate more abolitionist thinking and organising in the work they already do. It will kind of be like a campaign surgery where you can come and kind of present questions and ideas you have to speakers directly. So I'll just post that link and then we'll go into the breakout groups. Thanks so much. Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, guys. I hope that your breakout rooms were interesting and you had some good chats. We're just almost wrapping up now, but we're going to hear from each of our speakers again. They're just going to tell us what they think is a key and strategically important fight right now for people who are interested in contributing to abolition. Then all of you guys are going to be able to vote on what kind of resources that you might like to be sent as a kind of next step after this call. And then we will close after that. So I'm going to go through the speakers in the opposite order this time. So V, if you'd, sorry, unless I've caught you unawares, in which case I can go to Adam. I thought I'd give you a chance to go first.
No. Sorry, yeah, no, it's fine, don't worry about it.
Okay, awesome. So we'll hear from V about a strategically important fight for this movement right now.
Well, let me just pull my notes up. Cool. So I think, you know, we talk a lot about at Swarm about, and it came up in our little breakout group as well, about the kind of contention between feminism, like, you know, what we refer to colloquially as like turf and swerve feminism, but kind of what I consider to be carceral feminism. And it comes up a lot that it sounds sort of maybe quite petty, but there's this desire to wrestle the phrase abolitionist feminism away from them because, you know, the Julie Bindels and the Sarah Champions and the Jess Phillips use abolitionist feminism to talk about a feminist who wants to abolish the sex industry. And at Swan, we don't want to get that confused with the feminism who wants to abolish prisons and policing, because they very much are carceral feminists who want to kind of grow that. And, you know, their version of feminism is to have like trans people in male prisons and like stronger sentences, which is not what we consider. So we also believe that if you want fewer women to do sex work, you have to focus on expanding women's options, not criminalizing them for doing what they have to do to survive. Because at Swan we are feminists, but we denounce the carceral feminism, which seeks to take away our livelihoods. policies that increase violence against marginalised people aren't going to end patriarchy. And so we actually call on feminist organisations and groups to listen to sex worker-led organisations and allow us to work together. There are practical measures and movements that can support the lives of the most marginalised. And I was at a group the other day on mutual aid, and Juan Fernandez was talking about he gave these really amazing examples in relation to drug use and decriminalising drug use, and it was like safe injecting spaces, humanising the experience, sharing information. And I think there's a lot to be said that we can transpose onto sex worker rights, like specifically ending brothel keeping laws, decriminalising solicitation, decriminalise working together, decriminalise paying for sex, just completely decriminalise it and roll back police interventions and also reliance on the police for justice as well. But I guess also most importantly, it's to create a world where people don't need to sell sex to have their basic needs met. They don't need to sell sex to access drugs. They don't need to sell sex to access clean and safe housing. As Sonia mentioned before, and data sharing between NHS and the police and the Home Office. A lot of sex workers that we know won't access sexual health screening because they understand that there is a risk of deportation. They won't access, things like being treated for syphilis, or they're worried about friends overdosing because they're worried about being deported. If we can end those fears, that's part of it, because sex workers are part of the trans rights movement, and they're part of migrants' rights, drug user rights, student rights. We want to end gender oppression. So these are kind of key strategic, not necessarily kind of streamlined strategics, but they are the fights that Swarm are most interested in. I guess that's kind of it. I know I had 7 minutes, but I could sort of talk all day about it really. But that's it. It's just to wrestle the phrase abolitionist feminism away from feminism that wants to increase and have longer and harsher prison sentences.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Vee. Okay, if we can hear now from Sonia, so going in reverse order this time, from A Key Fight right now.
I think you're muted, Sonia.
Do you have your headphones again? Because
Hear me?
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. So a key fight right now, I think, needs to be thinking about the data sharing that's happening between the Home Office and public services, and how the government are using COVID to justify and normalise this culture of surveillance. And it's something that we need to be countering right now, because it's happening right now. As I said, data sharing goes both ways. So, under these policies, there has been a legal duty been put onto public sector workers to identify people who may be migrants and then notify the Home Office. So this has been, empowering just normal people, empowering in a toxic way to carry out the racist functions of the state. When their role and their only role as healthcare workers should be to provide, indiscriminate and unconditional care to everyone. And I think, there's some real similarities, I think, if you look at Prevent, and Prevent was something that was brought in 2005 under the Labour government. But if you think about, the methods that were used, how they used health workers and education workers to carry out the processes, how it was deeply racialized, how it was targeting or disproportionately targeting racial minorities, and how it marginalized communities and created this fear when accessing care. So some real similarities there. The other thing that we've found in the past few years, and this has been revealed, there was lots of secret mass data sharing agreements happening between the Home Office and things like school records, between the Home Office and NHS Digital. So the Home Office were accessing GP records without GPs knowing, so that they could target migrants and get confidential information about them to target them for deportation as well. And these agreements are still in place. There have been many organisations been calling for a firewall for that, but a lot of these agreements are still in place. And if that's not bad enough, the government are now talking about creating a hostile environment database And again, I talk about how all these things are connected. They are, I'm sure they're going to be learning some things from the gangs matrix, which, you all know about. And then in the past couple of months, the government have been talking about, again, under the premise of COVID, we're proposing to create this digital ID system. So essentially it's something where all of us will have this digital ID, which will be used, potentially to not just access healthcare, but it could be to even, go into the pub, go into public transport. So you can see, and alongside other things like the increasing use of facial technology, the biometric data when you enter the country, all of this use of technology and this surveillance culture, all the things that I talked about in the first part, the processes of marginalization and exclusion and oppression, you can see how through this use of technology, if we allow these things to happen, they'll be able to carry that out with, significantly increased efficiency and effectiveness. So it's really dangerous, and potentially we could be entering a really dark place if we don't effectively counter this now. And the other thing that I would, just like to touch on is we've seen during COVID a real resurgence of that good versus bad migrant narrative. So we saw, I don't know if you saw, there was a video that was put out a couple of months ago, and it had health workers, black and brown health workers saying, please be nice to us, we're treating you. We had a public outcry at the health surcharge. That was removed for health workers. It wasn't removed for other migrants. We had Boris Johnson go on TV and thank his immigrant nurses. He specifically said, we're thanking our migrant nurses. Given, the audacity of everything else that they're doing to migrants right now, it seemed pretty, insane. But it kind of, I guess it reminded me of, back when Churchill, at a time when Indians were fighting for the British in the World War, he was quite happy to let Indians, millions of them, die in the Bengal famine. And he said that they were, breeding like rabbits. So that I guess, we're still in the same place, this country, that we are, whether we like it or not, this country is reliant on migrants, and yet it treats them as disposable bodies. And I think we have to, I'll be finishing now, but just ask a question to ourselves, how we got to a place as a country where, just a few weeks ago, a lady called Mercy, a mother, died in this country. She died from starvation. She was a migrant. She died next to her malnourished baby. And we had a government minister go on live TV and was asked questions about it. And she didn't even show an ounce of remorse. And that's just normal. And how have we got to that place? And I would argue that us, and I'm talking about, the border left here, how we talk about migrants, the othering and the dehumanizing language that is used over the past decade has been complicit in, in the policies that the dehumanizing policies that we're seeing take place right now. So I think we have to be, as a movement, we have to be on the same page about this. It's not about, a starting point is not, Britain's a kind country, we should be nice to good migrants. That's not the starting point. The starting point is that everyone, regardless of the papers in your hand, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, deserves the right to healthcare, deserves the right to work, deserves the right to economic security, to social security, to decent pay, to workplace rights, just like the rest of us. And also be clear, as socialists, we know that borders, they allow the movement of people with privilege, but they are, inherently oppressive and harmful to those without privilege. So we need to be, I guess, using this moment. COVID has shown our shared humanity, showed how vulnerable and reliant we all are on each other. So as we're talking about, rebuilding the system, we have to be calling for the dismantling of this system that is inherently violent and inherently oppressive and is harmful to those, those who are the most vulnerable in our society. So yes, so we cannot allow this system that just systematically dehumanizes and oppresses our fellow human beings if we call ourselves socialists. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was brilliant. Remembering always keeping those principles at the heart of everything that we do. I'd like to now ask Connor to talk about one key strategic fight right now. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to talk not kind of about a specific fight, but sort of a broad strategic orientation I think we should have that should hopefully connect up what I was saying earlier about the macro and the micro level of politics. And that's to kind of talk a little bit more about this idea of the Imperial Boomerang effect, which was kind of developed by sort of political commentators and like Amy Césaire in the 20th century to describe this process by which empires use their colonial territories as laboratories for methods of social control, and they kind of perfect these methods of social control and repression in these colonies in places where there's very weak restrictions because they're in complete kind of totalitarian control of the colonial sphere, and then use those techniques, import them back through the circulation of personnel, ideas, and policies, circulate them back into the imperial metropole, and use them as methods of repressing the working class. And they usually start by applying them against migrant communities that come from those very same colonies where the policies were developed in the first place. So to give some examples of this, I mean, the British Metropolitan Police was first developed by Sir Robert Peel in colonial Ireland, and pretty much identical. There was it was slightly moderated, but a pretty identical bill was brought into Westminster when he was Home Secretary to establish Metropolitan Police after he'd established this model of policing as a sort of institution that's in between sort of the army and the people. This model was then brought in from Ireland after it was tested there and deployed against working class people, and well, first quite predominantly against Irish migrants in the UK, but very quickly broadly against all kinds of working class people, and was spread out across provincial England, and there was a lot of working class resistance to it as a result. And the British intelligence agencies as well were developed by the Committee of Imperial Defence. They were developed as, I mean, MI5, although we think of it as a domestic intelligence agency, originally had responsibility for the entirety of the British Empire, and it was developed very much with imperial security, imperial intelligence in mind. And you can see the same with the American national security state, which was developed in large part during the colonization of the Philippines from 1898 to 1914, when there was huge resistance when the Americans took over from the Spanish, and there was huge resistance amongst the Filipino population, and there had to be a massive amount of investment in counterinsurgency tactics by the US state. A lot of those tactics were then circulated back. Personnel came back into the US and started using them against, striking miners in Virginia, or wherever, radical political movements, dissidents, outcasts of all varieties. And we see this process happening over and over again. And today we can see the circulations happening all kinds of different ways. So the NYPD, for example, use theories and policies that were developed in the UK under the Prevent program. And they use those to target Muslim communities in New York. Palestinians are used as guinea pigs for Israeli counterinsurgency and newly developed weapons technologies, which are then circulated around the world. So basically, we need to make these connections, because when we're doing our local community organizing, and when we, of whatever variety, we eventually will come up against police forces and against intelligence agencies that are there in large part to crush working class resistance, and they have specific sections that are dedicated to undermining political resistance and dissent. When we come up against those, we have to realize that they are drawing on a repertoire of experience, of imperial experience that stretches back over a century, and that they continue to draw on that experience, and they continue to exchange policies and tactics and methods worldwide between the sort of worldwide ruling class. Now, they have their own conflicts and competition, but when it comes to the bottom line of repressing their populations and preventing progressive political movements, there's quite a high degree of cooperation. So if our enemy is cooperating at that level, we need to be cooperating on that level, and the local community organizing we're doing has to be connected to movements around the world that are also in a front against that ruling class, whether it's in the Philippines or West Papua or South Africa or the US or the UK. So yeah, I guess that kind of is trying to bring together the two sort of strands of the politics that I was talking about earlier, and it's sort of to implore people on the left to try and have an internationalist perspective. We had it a little bit more in the 60s and 70s, and I think since then there's been something of a regression on the left away from that kind of internationalist perspective, and it's ever more crucial in this era when ruling classes are collaborating even more than they were before, that we respond in kind with a kind of internationalist proletarian response and orientation.
Wicked, thank you so much, Connor. Okay, lastly, we're going to hear from Adam on the strategic and important fight that he sees. And then, then all of you guys are going to be able to vote on what you would like to hear more about. So hand it over to Adam.
So I guess I've already talked about racial violence quite a bit, but I think one of the other really important campaigns that a number of different organisations have been working with, particularly a number of youth organisations such as the Forefront Project, Hackney CVS, London Campaign Against Police and State Violence, and some other groups, are thinking about non-police solutions to serious youth violence. So we do know that although it's often pathologized and can in some ways be exaggerated by a lot of the press, problems of violent crime within lower income communities across this country. There is a problem that exists that does need to be addressed, and we know that the expansion of police powers, so whether it be tasers or injunctions or forms of surveillance, or ASBOs and those types of things, is often justified through this idea that there is this endemic problem of violent crime among young people in working class and other lower income communities, particularly communities of colour. And so one of the really important campaigns that a lot of youth groups have been doing are thinking about non-police solutions to the very real problem of violence among young people. And so different youth groups have been coming up with ideas which are centred around not having more police in schools, which is something the government is currently trying to do, but instead having mental health practitioners in schools, having youth workers in schools and other kind of trusted adults, having the school as a space which is open in the evenings and weekends, as many of our youth centres are being shut, so that young people have a safe place to stay, a warm and dry place to stay in their recreation time. All of these types of I guess youth-led activities have been really, really important for thinking about ways in which community safety, so protection from the threat of serious youth violence can be facilitated in a way that's community-led, in a way that isn't what we might call carceral, i.e. doesn't rely on punishing people and surveilling people, criminalising people, but in fact provides them with safe places to live and to study and to work and to interact and to socialise with each other. Other campaigns similar to this have been things around even things we might associate with quite banal Labour Party policies, right? That we remember from the last election. Things like reintroducing the educational maintenance allowance and scrapping tuition fees. Things like better investment in council housing, particularly for young people. Things like better investment in all of these types of social services can also be understood as a way of non-police solutions to serious youth violence, because they are mechanisms and policies and infrastructure that can help to keep young people off of the streets, less likely to come into contact with both the criminal justice system, but also less likely to come into contact with people who have also been harmed, who might inflict harm upon them for whatever reason. And so I think thinking about non-police solutions to serious youth violence is a really, really urgent task for not only helping to keep our young people safe, but also bringing people in to our campaigns who are most affected by both police violence and other forms of violence as well, and understanding that there are solutions to what often we're told by politicians and the police and the press to be the most pressing justification for the expansion of police and prison power.
Great, thank you so much, Adam. Because a lot of speakers there have mentioned the kind of campaigns and organisations that they would like people to kind of check out and do shout outs. If Hajera is there, I'm not sure if she is, but I thought, yeah, you are amazing. I think we should also hear Hajera's thoughts on that before we go to the final voting, because I'm sure you also have a lot to mention.
In terms of specific campaigns happening at the moment?
Yeah, just like shout outs and important campaigns and activities and fights you think are going on right now.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think, yeah, because we're doing so much overlapping work, people have mentioned some of the things I was going to mention anyway, but I'll mention the United Friends, Family and Friends campaign, because I'm not sure that's been mentioned yet. They do an annual walk, the next one happening on the end of October. So it's October 31st. So if people can attend, please do and support them. I also got sent a protest, I think, happening this weekend. Oh, sorry, I should have been organised and got it open. But yeah, it's against police violence, I think, happening in London. Yeah, protest against police racism and violence. That's happening on this Saturday at 1 p.m. at Scotland Yard. So if people can attend that, please do. Do you want me to talk a bit about some stuff on Abolitionist Futures, like our next reading group, or no?
That would be great. Yeah,
so we have our next, our reading group just finished, so we're probably taking a wee break before we start the next one. But the Abolitionist Futures Black Reading Group is starting again soon. On the 21st, I think, is the next one. All the dates and like the sign up information for that is on the website. And if you want to start up your own reading group, there's also like really detailed advice on how to do that, so you don't have to wait for someone to set one up.
Wicked. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so now we've come almost to the end of this. We're just going to ask people, hopefully, if the tech works properly, a poll should come up on your screen, which will ask you, yes, it's come up on my screen. Okay, that means it's working. Which will ask you, and I think you can pick multiple issues, what kind of area you would like to hear more about. And then the second question is just a little bit of what sort of resources you prefer to receive, podcasts and audio, videos and film, whether you like reading lists or reading groups. And again, you can select multiple. So pick what you fancy in the poll, and then we will make sure that we send all participants a kind of follow-up pack which takes into account the stuff that you're interested in and sends you the sort of resources which you would like to receive, and we'll ask our speakers what kind of stuff they might recommend as well. Obviously also in the chat there's quite a few links to organisations if anybody hasn't seen that, which might be of interest. Okay, policing health services, UK's role in policing globally have won.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know if there's a time limit on it, so I don't know if some people didn't get to vote.
It was quite quick.
Yeah, I think it like counted down and then just stopped. I'm really sorry, people. So only some people voted, but
basically there's a real preference for articles and a bit of audio. But we'll send you a kind of general resource pack for everybody so that you can do a little bit of follow-up work. And I will just, again in the chat, put the link to our second event, which is happening in 2 weeks on the 24th of September. And that's for people who'd really like some kind of one-on-one time with campaigners, thinking about how their own organisations and communities and campaigning work could become sort of more abolitionist, or how these kind of perspectives and fights might be incorporated into stuff that you guys are already doing on a day-to-day basis. So that link is in there and should be open for registration now. The poll has begun again.
I relaunched it because there were some people that were just about to vote and didn't. So okay, before you get timed out, make sure the other people that didn't vote straight away.
Pre-election. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another.
What's where I'm supposed to click?
Oh, I'm not sure. I can only see the control. We've got 4, 5. Oh, there we go. More people.
Okay.
Keep them coming. Can you see the results, Becca?
I can see the results.
Okay, cool.
Wow, it's changed now. There's still
Ooh.
articles absolutely win for form.
Okay.
And police and health services is way out in front with 83% interest. So,
Cool.
awesome. Okay, we'll take that into account, but we'll send you also a kind of general resources pack to all participants, just to see more interest. And as I say, everybody here is welcome to come to the 24th, and please send the link to your friends and stuff. That one will be very hands-on and kind of help you take this stuff into your own work day today. So we get to finish a little bit early today, 20 minutes spare for your evenings. I would just like to thank all of you for coming and kind of giving your Thursday evening to us. It's really, really appreciated. And thank all of our wonderful speakers and campaigners for sharing their work and the work that they're doing day in, day out on these issues. Also to our volunteer facilitators who helped in the breakout rooms and have been brilliant over the past few days, and the behind the scenes tech work of Hope and many other people who have helped to organise the World Transform Festival, which this session is part of. Thank you all so, so much. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Thursday evening, and we'll send you those resources in article form very soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
View the full TWT20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.